The wind swept through the town of Sand Creek like a forgotten whisper, carrying with it the scent of dust and dried sagebrush. A ghost town, it seemed, but to Carter Boone, it felt like home. He stood at the edge of the dry street, looking at the long-abandoned saloon where, years ago, laughter and whiskey had flowed freely. Now, the wind sent loose papers tumbling across the porch, chasing away the memories that refused to fade. Carter's spurs jingled faintly as he walked toward the hitching post. His boots, cracked and worn from endless miles, scraped against the cracked wooden planks. He didn't need to be here, didn't want to be, but something about Sand Creek called to him. Something tied him to the place, and it wasn't the land he once owned or the people he used to know. It was her, May Renshaw. He had kicked her aside once, and he had spent years trying to bury the guilt of it. Carter could still hear the sound of her voice, soft but strong, calling after him as he left town all those years ago. But he hadn't turned back then, not even once. He had chosen a different path, one paved with promises of wealth and security, with Eloise Finch, the daughter of a cattle baron whose name carried weight in every saloon across the frontier. May had never stood a chance against that kind of future. He had been foolish, selfish, blinded by a hunger for something more than love, more than the quiet life that May had offered, the life she had wanted with him. Carter had walked away, choosing Eloise's polished beauty and a life of comfort over May's rough-hewn strength. And in doing so, he had lost her, or so he thought. Eloise had come from a fine family, the kind of family that expected their daughter to marry a man of means. Carter had given her everything: his name, his ranch, his heart, though it never felt like enough. There had been no warmth between them, only an endless succession of empty days and colder nights. Eloise had long since stopped pretending to love him. She had never truly understood him. And now their marriage felt like an arrangement between strangers, nothing more. But May had been different. She was the daughter of the town blacksmith, a woman who had grown up among fire and iron, a woman who knew how to hold her own in the wild, untamed land. She was tough, in ways Carter couldn't understand at first. She was a force, sharp, unyielding, and fiercely independent. He had been drawn to her strength, to the way she moved with such quiet purpose. When they had been together, it felt like home. But he had been too young, too foolish, to see it for what it was. Now, standing on the threshold of the past, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at the edge of something much larger than the town of Sand Creek. It was as though fate had drawn him back here for a reason, though he couldn't yet see what it was. He reached for the reins of his horse, the familiar weight of them bringing him back to the present. It had been too long since he had been here, and longer still since he had thought about May. But something gnawed at him, something he couldn't ignore. The word on the wind was that May had disappeared years ago, just after he had left. Some said she'd gone off into the hills to live alone. Others whispered she had run off with another man. But no one really knew for sure, and Carter hadn't cared enough to ask. But now, in the dimming light of dusk, as the sky turned a bruised purple, Carter felt a sharp pang of regret, a deep, biting ache that seemed to stretch all the way to his bones. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had been wrong, that he had made a choice that he couldn't undo. With a grunt, he swung himself into the saddle and urged his horse forward, riding down the familiar path toward Widow's Bend. May's family had once lived just outside of town, in a modest cabin on the outskirts, a place where the wind didn't sting so harshly and the land stretched out endlessly before you. The last time Carter had seen her, she had been standing at the gate, watching him ride away, her face a mask of sadness and determination. She had said nothing as he left, but he had heard the words unsaid, the final farewell, the quiet abandonment. The ride to Widow's Bend was long and slow. Carter's mind wandered between the years, between the decisions he had made and the ones he hadn't. His thoughts clung to May, to the way she had always carried herself, so steady, so strong. She had never needed him, not in the way he had convinced himself she did. She had needed someone who would stand by her, someone who wouldn't turn his back when things got tough. As the night fell, the air grew cold. The moon rose high, casting silver light over the barren land, the harsh landscape stretching in all directions. Carter's thoughts turned darker. The whispers he had heard about the Red Knives gang, a band of ruthless outlaws who had been terrorizing ranches and settlements across the region, lingered in his mind. They had been the ones to bring him back to Sand Creek, their rage striking too close to home, too close to the land he had left behind. But it wasn't the gang he sought, it was May. She had always been capable, more than capable, of surviving. But something in Carter's chest told him she wasn't the same woman she had been. The moonlight revealed the familiar landmarks, the old homestead, the barn, the distant hill where she used to walk in the evenings. He knew the place by heart, and yet, as he approached the weathered cabin, a sense of dread twisted in his gut. It wasn't just the fear of what he might find. It was the fear of what he might have lost forever. He dismounted outside the cabin and tied his horse to the post. The door was slightly ajar, the dim glow of firelight spilling from within. Carter hesitated, his hand resting on the worn doorframe. He had thought he would find May here, waiting for him, angry, perhaps, but still May. But the reality was different. He didn't know what he expected, but it wasn't this. He stepped inside, and the air smelled of smoke and old leather, the familiar scent of a life lived in the wilderness. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the walls. And there she was, May. She stood in the corner, her back to him, her silhouette stark against the firelight. She was older now, her features softened by time, but still unmistakable. "May," he said, his voice rough, like it hadn't been used in years. She turned slowly, her eyes narrowing as she took in his presence. There was no surprise in her gaze, no shock, only the faintest trace of recognition. "You're late," she said, her voice as steady as ever, though there was something in it that Carter couldn't place. The same calm confidence, yes, but something harder, something different. "May I know why you're here," she interrupted, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "And I'm not interested in hearing it." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Carter stood there, feeling more like a stranger than ever. May had changed, but it wasn't just her. It was him, and he had no idea if he could ever make it right. "You've got a lot of nerve," she said, finally breaking the silence. "Coming here, after all this time, after what you did." Carter opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. He had spent so long running from this, running from her, running from the truth, that now, in the face of her unwavering gaze, he realized he had never really faced it at all. May's gaze didn't soften as Carter stood there, exposed under the weight of her quiet judgment. She said nothing for a long moment, as if weighing the years between them, the miles that had stretched further than Carter could have ever imagined. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound in the room, but it felt like the entire world was holding its breath. "Why are you here, Carter?" Her voice was calm, deliberate, but there was an edge to it that cut deeper than the sting of the wind outside. "You didn't come back for me." Carter swallowed hard, his throat dry. He hadn't expected forgiveness, but this distance, this absolute certainty in her tone, it crushed something inside of him. He thought of the time they had spent together, the way her presence had always calmed him, the way she had stood by him in silence, supporting him in a way he had never truly understood. "No," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "I came back because something's happening. The Red Knives, they've been raiding my ranch. They're going to come for me. For us." May raised an eyebrow, the faintest flicker of interest crossing her face. But it was fleeting, gone as soon as it appeared. She crossed her arms over her chest and leaned against the wall, studying him with that same steady gaze. "I heard about it," she said quietly. "Your ranch, your cattle, Eloise." Carter flinched at the mention of his wife. The guilt, the weight of his choices, settled heavier on his shoulders. Eloise was more than just his wife. She was the daughter of the wealthiest landowner in the area. He had married her to secure his place in the world, a life of ease, a future where he didn't have to scrape by. But it hadn't been enough. It had never been enough. "You don't understand," he said, desperate now. "I never asked for this. I didn't ask for any of it." May studied him for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then, with a sharp, almost bitter laugh, she pushed herself away from the wall and walked over to the small table in the corner. She poured herself a glass of water and drank it without looking at him. "You didn't ask for it?" she repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. You didn't ask for a life built on lies, on the backs of others? You didn't ask to be the man who turned his back on the one person who would have stood by him, no matter what. Carter's heart sank, but he couldn't argue with her. He had made his choices, and now they were catching up to him. The weight of them was unbearable, a burden he could no longer ignore. May, he said softly, his voice raw. I need your help. The gang's out there, the Red Knives. They're coming for everything. I can't stop them alone. She set the glass down with a sharp clink, her eyes narrowing as she turned back toward him. Help you? She asked, her tone cool. You come here, asking for help, but you're still the same man who walked away from me all those years ago. I'm not interested in playing the savior. Her words stung more than Carter expected, but he didn't have time for pride or ego. He had to make her understand. His survival depended on it. Please, he said, his voice cracking. I can't do this alone. I've made mistakes, May. I've spent years running from them, but I can't run anymore. Not this time. They'll destroy everything. May paused for a long time, her face unreadable. Carter could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he didn't dare speak again. He knew she was considering it, weighing her options, perhaps considering whether or not the same part of her that had once loved him could be stirred again. It was a long shot. He knew that, but he couldn't let the past define the future. Not when everything was on the line. Finally, May sighed, her shoulders sagging just slightly. She walked over to a small chest at the foot of the bed and opened it, revealing a collection of old rifles, hunting knives, and other tools of survival. Carter's eyes widened in surprise, though he shouldn't have been surprised at all. May had always been capable, more than capable. She had never needed him. She had always survived on her own terms. You want my help, Carter? She said, her voice no longer bitter, but laced with something colder, something far more dangerous. Then get your horse. We leave at dawn. Carter didn't waste a moment. He nodded quickly, the rush of relief flowing through him in waves. But as he turned to leave, May's voice stopped him. I'm not doing this for you, she said, her words sharp and final. I'm doing this because the Red Knives don't get to take what's ours. Not this time. He looked back at her, a fleeting moment of understanding passing between them. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't love. It was something else entirely, a shared sense of justice, a bond forged by the unforgiving land they both knew too well. The next morning, the sun rose over the desert like a fiery wound on the horizon. Carter had saddled his horse, the familiar weight of it both comforting and foreign in the wake of his recent choices. May emerged from the cabin, her pack slung over her shoulder, a rifle resting on her back. She looked every bit the woman he had known, the woman who could survive anything. And yet, there was something different about her now. She was no longer the hopeful girl he had left behind. She was the woman who had built a life from nothing, who had learned to stand on her own 2 feet, regardless of the cost. They rode out in silence, the desert stretching before them like an endless sea of sand and dust. Carter's mind raced with the thoughts of what lay ahead. The Red Knives were ruthless. He had seen them in action before, merciless, fast, and unpredictable. They were like a storm, sweeping through towns and leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. But they had never faced someone like May. And Carter was beginning to realize that, despite his own shortcomings, he had never faced anyone like her either. As they made their way through the harsh landscape, Carter's thoughts turned inward, to the choices he had made, the things he had left behind. The land was silent around them, a vast emptiness that seemed to reflect the hollowness inside him. But for the first time in years, it wasn't just emptiness. There was something else now, a glimmer of hope, however small, that perhaps redemption wasn't entirely out of reach. They rode through the day and into the night, the sky above them a blanket of stars. And with every mile they covered, Carter felt something shift inside him. It was as though the weight of his past was slowly lifting, piece by piece, as they drew closer to the Red Knives' camp. May said little, but her actions spoke volumes. She moved with purpose, her every step measured, as if the land itself bent to her will. She had always been this way, strong, independent, a force of nature. But now, for the first time in a long time, Carter could see that she wasn't just surviving. She was thriving. When they finally reached the edge of the canyon, where the Red Knives had made their camp, Carter felt a wave of fear mixed with anticipation. He had come here for survival, for justice, but now, as the moon rose high above them, he understood that he was fighting for something more. He was fighting for the man he had been, the man he could still become. But more than that, he was fighting for May, the woman who had never needed him, but had given him the chance to prove he could be something more. And as they moved toward the edge of the canyon, Carter knew that this was just the beginning. The fight was coming, and this time, he wouldn't be running. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and fire as Carter and May made their way into the narrow canyon, the jagged rock walls on either side looming like ancient sentinels. The shadows of dusk were quickly fading, replaced by the cold clarity of moonlight. Above them, the sky was a deep, unsettling red, as though the heavens themselves were bearing witness to the violence that was soon to unfold. Carter had seen many things in his time: gunfights, cattle stampedes, the ruthless actions of outlaws, but nothing compared to the atmosphere here. The Red Knives were close. He could feel them like a dark cloud on the horizon, their presence pressing down on the land, on his very chest. They had no mercy, no honor. They took what they wanted, when they wanted, and soon they would come for everything Carter had ever known. He glanced over at May, riding beside him, her eyes sharp, scanning the rocky terrain. She hadn't said much since their departure from Sand Creek, but her silence spoke volumes. She was focused, ready, prepared for what lay ahead. May had always been this way, always steady, always strong. In the years they had been apart, she hadn't changed. But Carter had. And now, as the weight of his past mistakes hung heavily on his shoulders, he wasn't sure if that change would be enough to survive what was coming. May's voice broke the silence, low and purposeful. The Red Knives set up camp near the old mines. You'd be wise to stay low and keep your head down. They don't take kindly to strangers. Carter nodded, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver, the familiar weight a reminder of the man he used to be. I know. I've seen them in action before. May didn't respond, but her lips tightened into a line, her jaw set with determination. The Red Knives weren't just a gang. They were a scourge, a plague on the land. They didn't just rob and kill. They destroyed everything in their path. Farms, towns, families. They left only ashes behind. Carter's heart twisted at the thought of what they had done to his ranch, to the life he had built with Eloise. And now they were coming for May's land as well. As they drew closer to the mouth of the canyon, the temperature dropped, and a faint, eerie wind began to blow, carrying the distant sound of laughter and shouting on the breeze. Carter tensed, his senses on high alert. The Red Knives were near, and with them, the promise of death. The camp came into view, a flickering collection of firelight and shadows. Carter could make out the figures of men, lounging around the campfire, their rough voices carrying through the night air. The smell of cooking meat mixed with the pungent odor of sweat and tobacco. At the center of it all, a large, dark figure stood, his silhouette towering against the firelight. That's their leader, May said, her voice tight. Cullen Blake. He's the one we have to worry about. Carter's gaze narrowed on Blake, his large frame unmistakable. The man exuded a kind of malevolent confidence, the way a lion would before it struck. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar running down the left side of his face, a mark that spoke of his brutal history. The Red Knives were his creation, a gang that had grown in power and fear over the years. Carter had heard stories of how Blake had burned entire towns to the ground, how he had left no survivors, not even women and children. The rest of the gang was spread out around the camp, laughing and talking, but there was no mistaking the danger in the air. Every movement, every step was calculated. Every man in that camp was a weapon, ready to strike at a moment's notice. May pulled her horse to a stop at the edge of the canyon, just out of sight of the camp. She gestured for Carter to do the same. She was calm, her breathing steady, but Carter could feel the tension building in the pit of his stomach. This was it, the moment they had been riding toward, the reckoning. May turned to face him, her eyes locking with his. For the first time since their reunion, there was something softer in her gaze, a flicker of the woman he had once known, the woman who had loved him without hesitation, without question. But that woman was buried deep, and the one who stood before him now had no illusions about him, about the world they lived in. "This is your chance, Carter," she said, her voice low. "You're not just fighting for your life anymore. You're fighting for what's left of your soul. Don't screw it up." Carter's chest tightened at her words, but there was no time to linger on them. The gravity of the situation was too great, the stakes too high. He had spent years running from his past, running from the mistakes he had made. Now, standing on the edge of this battle, he understood that there was no running left. The only choice was to face it. The moon overhead cast a strange glow on the canyon, the blood-red hue casting an unnatural light over the landscape. It felt like an omen, a sign that what was about to happen would be unlike anything Carter had ever faced. But he had no choice but to move forward. May pulled her rifle from her back and checked it quickly, her movements efficient and practiced. Carter followed suit, drawing his own revolver and ensuring it was loaded and ready. His hand shook, just slightly, but he steadied it, tightening his grip on the cold steel. He couldn't afford to hesitate. They moved toward the camp with the quiet, purposeful steps of predators stalking their prey. May led the way, her eyes scanning the terrain, while Carter stayed close behind, his hand on the grip of his revolver. They had the element of surprise on their side, but the red knives weren't known for being easily caught off guard. They crept closer, the firelight flickering ahead. The laughter of the men around the campfire grew louder, more raucous. Carter could hear snippets of conversation, their crude jokes, their plans for the next raid, the gleam in their voices that spoke of violence to come. And at the center of it all, Blake. He had to be stopped. May signaled for Carter to halt, and he obeyed without question. She surveyed the camp, her eyes narrowing on the men closest to the fire. There were 4 of them, all armed, all dangerous. But they were drunk, distracted, and too caught up in their own amusement to notice the approaching threat. May lifted her rifle and aimed it at one of the men, a young, scruffy-looking outlaw whose hands were wrapped around a bottle of whiskey. With a sharp exhale, she squeezed the trigger, the sound of the shot ringing out through the canyon like a thunderclap. The man dropped to the ground without a sound, his body crumpling into the dirt. The others around the fire froze, their eyes snapping to the source of the shot. But before they could react, Carter was already moving, his revolver flashing in the firelight as he took out 2 more men, quick and efficient. Blake roared in anger, his voice low and guttural, and drew his massive revolver from his hip. His eyes locked onto May, the fury in them unmistakable. "You think you can stop me, girl?" Blake's voice was a low growl, the threat hanging in the air like a storm. May didn't flinch. She stood tall, her rifle still aimed at him, her finger hovering over the trigger. Carter stepped forward, his revolver aimed squarely at Blake's chest. "This ends tonight, Blake," Carter said, his voice steady, despite the pounding of his heart. "You and your gang, you're finished." The wind had died down after the chaos of the battle, leaving behind an eerie calm that seemed to seep into the bones of the desert itself. The blood-red moon still hung in the sky, casting a pale light across the rocky terrain, now littered with the bodies of the red knives. The silence that followed the gunfire felt unnatural, like the earth was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Carter stood over the body of Cullen Blake, the gang leader's lifeless form sprawled out in the dirt, his revolver still clutched in his hand. The fight had been brutal, but it was over. May was a few paces away, her rifle slung across her back, her eyes scanning the horizon, as though expecting more danger to appear. But it wasn't the threat of more outlaws that weighed on Carter's mind. It was the man lying dead at his feet. Cullen Blake's death marked the end of the red knives, but Carter knew that his own reckoning had only just begun. May turned to him, her face unreadable in the low light. The flickering fire cast shadows across her features, sharpening the angles of her face, making her look like a stranger, despite the years they had once shared. But he saw her, really saw her, through the bloodshed and the violence, and what he saw made him realize something he had never allowed himself to acknowledge. She had never needed him. In all the years they had been apart, May had forged her own path. She had fought battles, survived the harshest conditions the desert could throw at her, and carved out a life in a world that offered nothing but struggle. Carter had come back to her, to the very woman he had abandoned, expecting to find the person who had once been his anchor. But she had moved on, had built something for herself in the places he had never dared to tread. "I told you this was never about you," May said, her voice steady, almost cold, as she approached him. "You came back for a fight, Carter. You didn't come back for redemption." Her words cut deeper than he expected, and Carter felt the old weight of guilt creep back in. He had come back, not for her, but for the promise of something more, something he could never truly have. He looked down at Blake's body again, his chest tight. "I came back to stop them. To stop him," he said quietly, his voice heavy with a mixture of shame and resolve. "But I didn't think it would be this way. I didn't think it would mean losing everything." May gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, her expression unreadable. "You didn't lose anything, Carter. You only lost yourself. But there's nothing left of that man now. Not after tonight." The word struck him like a physical blow. The man he had been, the man who had walked away from May all those years ago, was gone. He had fought for survival, for something to hold on to. But in the end, he realized that all he had been fighting for was the chance to escape the weight of his own choices. "We should go," May said, her tone finally softening. "The desert doesn't forget. It remembers everything, every sin, every soul that's passed through it. You've made your stand, Carter. Now, you need to make your peace." They stood together, side by side, looking at the remnants of the Red Knives camp. The desert stretched out before them, vast and empty, the dark sky above them endless and indifferent. Carter could feel the weight of it all, the lives lost, the decisions made, the silence that had followed the gunfire. It felt like a chapter had ended, but one he wasn't sure he was ready to close. "Do you think it matters?" he asked quietly, his voice distant. "The things we've done, the people we've hurt?" May's gaze was steady, unwavering as she looked out at the empty horizon. "It matters to some," she said after a long pause, "but not to the desert. The desert doesn't care about justice or redemption. It doesn't care about who you were. It just remembers." Carter stood there, letting her words settle into him, feeling the heaviness of the past like 1,000 invisible chains. The desert was vast, but it wasn't empty. It had seen everything, and what it had witnessed, what they had both witnessed, was something that could never be undone. But perhaps, just perhaps, it was something they could still learn from. As the sun began to rise over the desert, the world slowly began to return to its usual rhythm. The wind kicked up again, carrying with it the harsh scent of the earth, the dust, the remnants of the night. Carter turned to May, who had already mounted her horse, her rifle resting against her back once more. "You're right," he said, his voice low but steady. "I've lost too much already, but I'm not going to lose any more." May didn't respond immediately. She looked at him, her expression softening for just a moment, a flicker of something that resembled the woman he had once known. Then she nodded and spurred her horse forward. "Let's go then," she said, her voice no longer cold but firm. "There's nothing left here." Carter hesitated for just a moment, then followed her, his hand gripping the reins tightly as they rode into the morning light. The world was wide open before them, the desert stretching out into the distance, both unforgiving and beautiful, a land that had witnessed too much to ever forget. But for the first time in a long time, Carter felt a strange sense of clarity, as though the path ahead, though uncertain, was no longer one he feared. He had fought the battles he needed to fight. He had faced his past and the consequences of his choices, and now there was nothing left but to move forward. As they rode together, side by side, into the vast, unforgiving landscape, Carter understood something May had known all along. The desert remembered. It remembered everything, but it didn't hold on to it. Not forever. And for the first time in years, Carter thought he might just have a chance to let go. The wind picked up, and the distant howls of coyotes echoed through the canyon behind them, as though the earth itself was calling them forward, toward whatever lay ahead. And Carter, for the first time, didn't look back.